Chapter 1. I keep catching myself thinking about how much effort I used to put into explaining things that should have been obvious. How many times I tried to talk my way into being understood instead of just showing up in a way that made understanding automatic. That realization doesn't come with confidence at first. It comes with embarrassment, the quiet kind. The kind where you realize you are asking people to work too hard just to see what you already knew was there. Because here's the truth nobody likes to say out loud. People don't want to work to understand you. They don't want to decode you. They don't want to investigate your potential or imagine what you might become if they just gave you a chance. They respond to what's clear, what's immediate, what's legible in seconds. And when you accept that, not angrily, not defensively, but honestly, everything changes. You stop resenting the world for not seeing you and start asking why you made it so hard to see in the first place. You've probably felt this in rooms where you knew you were more than what was being perceived. You walk in, you scan, you feel the energy, and you know you don't register the way you should, not because you're insecure, but because you're aware. You know what you bring. You know your discipline, your ambition, your mind. And yet none of that is translating. People look past you. Conversations don't gravitate toward you. Attention doesn't linger. And instead of adjusting the signal, you tell yourself it's shallow, that it shouldn't matter, that the right people will see you eventually. But eventually is expensive. Eventually costs years. Eventually costs opportunities. Eventually costs momentum. And the men who wait for eventually end up bitter. Not because they were wrong about their value, but because they never learned how to make that value obvious without words. You don't get points for hidden depth. You get results for visible clarity. That's the part that hurts the ego until it frees it. Think about how quickly you judge things yourself. A restaurant, a website, a product, a movie. You don't sit there saying, well, maybe it's amazing if I give it time. You look at the presentation and decide whether it's worth your attention, and you don't feel guilty about that. You don't apologize for it. You call it efficiency. Attraction works the same way. People decide whether to lean in before you ever speak, and if you lose them in that window, no amount of personality saves you later. This is where men confuse humility with neglect. They think caring about how they look means they're shallow. They think investing in appearance means they're trying too hard. They think standing out means peacocking. And so they intentionally underperform visually and then complain that nobody notices them. That's not humility. That's sabotage disguised as virtue. Humility is quiet confidence. Neglect is refusing to sharpen the signal and then resenting the noise for drowning you out. You don't need to be flashy. You don't need to be loud. You don't need to be rich. You need to be intentional. Intentional about how you present yourself. Intentional about how you move. Intentional about what people can immediately understand about you without you explaining anything. Are you disciplined? Are you put together? Do you respect yourself? Do you take pride in your presence? Those questions get answered instantly by how you look long before you open your mouth. And people trust those answers more than anything you say afterward. You've seen this play out even when it frustrates you. The guy who doesn't seem particularly impressive intellectually, but gets attention effortlessly. Not because he's better than you, but because his presentation removes doubt. He looks like someone worth paying attention to. His grooming is sharp, his clothes fit, his posture is calm, his energy says, I take myself seriously. And because of that, other people do too. Not because they're shallow, because they're human. This is why game doesn't save you if the trailer is bad. You can be smooth, you can be clever, you can be funny. But if the first impression doesn't invite curiosity, you don't get the chance to use any of that. You never get to the conversation, you never get to the personality, you never get to show depth because nobody stuck around long enough to discover it. And instead of accepting that reality, men call it unfair and keep losing the same way over and over again. There's a difference between doing too much and doing too little. Doing too much is loud, insecure, compensatory. Doing too little is lazy and self-defeating. Most men aren't doing too much. They're doing too little and calling it balance. They're underdressed, undergroomed, underinvested, and then shocked when they're overlooked. Not because women are cruel, but because attention flows toward clarity. And clarity is visual first. You don't need designer labels to be clear. Designer can help if you can afford it, but it's not the foundation. Fit matters more than price. Clean matters more than brand. Grooming matters more than trends. Teeth matter, hair matters, shoes matter, hygiene matters. Not because they make you superior, but because they make your presence readable. They remove friction. They tell people, this man has standards, and people instinctively respect standards, even when they can't articulate why. Here's a moment that burned this into my mind. I watched a man I knew struggle for years with dating. Same complaints, same frustrations, same belief that women were overlooking him for shallow reasons. One year, he didn't talk about it. He didn't complain. He didn't explain. He changed how he presented himself, not extravagantly, deliberately, cleaned up his grooming, learned what fit his body, took care of his teeth, paid attention to details he used to dismiss, and the shift was immediate, not because he became someone else, because he finally stopped hiding behind indifference. When he told me later, he said something simple. I realized I was asking people to imagine my value instead of showing it. That sentence sticks because it applies everywhere. If you want to be chosen, you can't blend in. Blending in feels safe. It feels humble. It feels non-threatening. But it also makes you invisible. And invisibility is not neutrality. It's a disadvantage. Standing out doesn't mean screaming. It means being distinct, being intentional, being clear enough that choosing you feels easy instead of risky. You've probably worried about doing too much, about being judged, about looking like you're trying. But trying is not the sin. Trying without intention is. People can feel the difference. Intention feels grounded. Insecurity feels loud. One invites respect. The other invites scrutiny. And most men never cross that line because they stop themselves before they even start. They'd rather be invisible than risk being seen and judged. And that choice costs them more than any criticism ever could. If this is landing uncomfortably, pause for a second and like the video. Not because it's motivational, but because it's honest. That click is you admitting you've been making things harder than they need to be. And honesty is the first step to leverage. Here's the core truth that changes everything. When you make yourself the obvious choice, you don't chase, you don't perform, you don't convince, you don't explain. Your presence does the talking. Your appearance answers questions before they're asked. People lean in because it feels safe to lean in, because the signal is strong. And strong signals get chosen without negotiation. You don't need to look rich. You need to look intentional. You don't need to look perfect. You need to look cared for. You don't need to impress everyone. You need to be unmistakable to the right people. And once you understand that, you stop arguing with reality and start using it. You stop working harder and start working smarter. You stop blending in and start standing out quietly, confidently, without apology. This chapter isn't telling you to flex. It's telling you to respect yourself enough to be visible, to stop hiding your value behind comfort and fear, to accept that presentation is not superficial, it's functional. It's how the world reads you before you ever get to speak. And when you finally align how you look with who you are, something strange happens. You stop asking to be chosen. You start being chosen. Chapter 2. The shift doesn't happen all at once. It sneaks up on you in moments that feel almost accidental. You notice how differently people respond when you clean up a little more than usual. You walk into a room and eyes linger a half-second longer. Conversations don't feel forced. You're not fighting for space. You're being offered it. And instead of feeling powerful, It feels unsettling because it confirms something you've avoided for a long time. You were never unseen because you lacked value. You were unseen because you made that value hard to read. This is where most men get defensive. They hear talk about appearance and immediately think someone is telling them to be fake, shallow, or materialistic. But that reaction misses the point completely. Presentation isn't about pretending to be someone you're not. It's about removing unnecessary obstacles between who you are and how you're perceived. Every obstacle you leave in place forces you to compensate somewhere else. More talking, more explaining, more effort, and effort when it comes to attraction always reads as imbalance. You already know this instinctively, even if you've never said it out loud. Think about the men you've met who seem to glide through social situations. They're not begging for attention. They're not overperforming. They're not louder than everyone else. They're just clear. Their presence answers questions before anyone has to ask them. Are they put together? Are they confident? Are they someone worth engaging with? Those answers arrive instantly, not because they're better men, but because they understand leverage. Leverage is what this conversation is really about. You can have substance without leverage and still struggle. You can have leverage without substance and still win short term. But when you have both, the game becomes unfair in your favor. Presentation is leverage. It does the heavy lifting so your personality doesn't have to. It buys you time. It earns you curiosity. It makes people want to hear what you have to say instead of deciding they already know who you are. Most men are trying to win conversations they never should have had to fight for in the first place. They're trying to prove themselves verbally because visually they already lost. And instead of fixing the root, they double down on the compensation. More jokes, more stories, more bravado, more game. That might work occasionally, but it's exhausting, and it only attracts people who respond to effort instead of presence. That's not the dynamic you want long term. This is where the movie analogy actually matters. You've skipped movies with bad trailers. Everyone has. You didn't think, well, maybe it's secretly brilliant. You made a snap decision based on presentation and moved on. And you didn't feel immoral for doing it. You called it efficient. Attraction works the same way. The trailer decides whether the audience stays long enough to watch the story. And if your trailer is confusing, sloppy, or forgettable, the story never gets a chance. What trips men up is that they take this personally instead of practically. They think, so my worth is only skin deep. No. Your access is skin deep. The doorway is visual. The room inside is where substance matters. But if you refuse to build a proper doorway, people don't get inside. They don't know what they missed. They just move on. And blaming them for that is like blaming water for flowing downhill. You start realizing how many things you wrote off as unimportant were actually doing quiet damage. Hair, you never really figured out because you told yourself it didn't matter. Clothes that technically fit but never looked intentional. Shoes you didn't think anyone noticed. Teeth you kept putting off because it felt superficial. Jewelry you dismissed as unnecessary. None of these things are required individually, but together they send a message. And when the message is unclear, people assume average, always. Average isn't an insult, it's a default. When people don't have information, they fill the gap with the most common assumption. And most men don't understand how often they're being read as default simply because they didn't provide a clearer signal. You can be exceptional internally and still get treated like the baseline if you refuse to communicate otherwise. Communication doesn't start with words, it starts with appearance. That's uncomfortable to admit until you realize how much control that gives you. There's a moment that usually flips the switch for men who finally get this. It's not when they get a compliment. It's when they stop getting dismissed. When conversations don't end abruptly. When women don't look past them mid-sentence. When attention feels relaxed instead of strained. And they realize nothing about their personality changed. Only the ease with which people could recognize it did. That realization is humbling and empowering at the same time. You also start noticing the inverse. Men who look expensive but have nothing behind it, the ones who rely purely on flash. They get attention fast, but it doesn't stick. Conversations collapse, interest fades. That's the difference between presentation as leverage and presentation as deception. One supports substance, the other tries to replace it. And people can feel the difference quicker than you think. The goal isn't to trick anyone. The goal is to remove doubt long enough for truth to be discovered. This is where the fear of doing too much comes from. Men are afraid of crossing into deception, so they stay stuck in neglect. But neglect isn't honesty. Neglect is abdication. It's refusing to curate your signal and then pretending that makes you authentic. Authenticity doesn't mean careless, it means aligned. When how you look matches how you think about yourself, people relax around you. There's coherence. And coherence is attractive because it feels stable. You don't have to wear the most expensive anything. But you do have to look like you chose what you're wearing. You don't have to be flashy. But you do have to look intentional. You don't have to scream status. But you should whisper standards. Standards show up in details, clean lines, proper fit, grooming that says you pay attention, accessories that look deliberate instead of random. These aren't flexes, they're signals. And signals are how humans navigate complexity quickly. There's also something men don't talk about enough. When you invest in your appearance, it changes how you move. You stand straighter, you slow down, you stop fidgeting, you stop shrinking. And that internal shift is visible even to people who don't consciously register why you feel different. Presence amplifies presentation. Presentation unlocks presence. They feed each other in a loop most men never enter because they stop at the first step. I've watched men resist this idea for years and then change their tune after one honest experiment. They decide to actually try. They invest in grooming. They clean up their style. They take care of their teeth. They find what works for their body instead of hiding it. And suddenly, the world responds differently. And consistency is what breaks denial. You can't call it coincidence when it keeps happening. If you're listening to this and thinking you already know it, ask yourself a harder question. Are you actually applying it, or are you intellectually agreeing while emotionally resisting? Agreement without action changes nothing. Resistance disguised as principle keeps you stuck. And stuck men love ideas that don't require them to change. This one does. That's why it works. If this chapter is hitting, share the video with someone who keeps saying, looks don't matter while secretly feeling overlooked. Not to shame them, to wake them up. And if you're starting to see how much leverage you've been leaving on the table, subscribe. Not because this is about fashion or flexing, but because understanding leverage is the difference between working endlessly for attention and having attention come to you naturally. This isn't about becoming someone else. It's about stopping yourself from being misread. And once you understand how much power there is in being legible, you stop asking whether presentation matters and start asking why you waited so long to take control of it. Chapter 3. There's a moment that comes after the initial excitement fades, after the compliments stop feeling surprising, after the novelty of being noticed wears off, where you realize the real shift wasn't external at all, it was internal. You're not thinking about how you look anymore. You're thinking about where you're going. Presentation did its job and got out of the way. That's when you understand why this was never about vanity. It was about removing friction so your attention could move back to things that actually matter. Before, so much of your energy was tied up in compensating. Compensating for being overlooked. Compensating for not being taken seriously. Compensating for that subtle sense of being underestimated. You were trying to make up for weak signals with effort, personality, patience, humor, tolerance. And now that you don't have to do that anymore, there's space, mental space, emotional space. You stop performing and start operating. That's the part nobody sells you on, but it's the part that changes your life the most. You notice how conversations change when you're not fighting the first impression. People listen differently. They ask better questions. They don't interrupt as much. They don't rush to categorize you. You're not trying to win them over. You're deciding whether you even want to engage. That reversal is subtle, but it's everything. The man who's trying to be chosen is reactive. The man who's already legible gets to choose his pace, his responses, his boundaries. Presentation doesn't just attract attention, it restores agency. This is where men misunderstand the Rolls-Royce image or the luxury references. They think it's about flexing. It's not. It's about certainty. When something looks unmistakably high quality, the brain stops questioning it. Not because it's perfect, but because it's clear. A Rolls-Royce doesn't need to explain itself. It doesn't need to rev its engine or justify its price. Its presence answers the question. That's the feeling you're trying to create with yourself, not excess, certainty. And certainty doesn't require money. Money can amplify it, sure. If you can afford certain things, you should enjoy them. There's nothing virtuous about pretending otherwise. But certainty starts with care, with intentionality, with refusing to look accidental. Most men look accidental, like they woke up and life happened to them, like they didn't choose how they present themselves, like they didn't think about how they'd be read. And accidental men get accidental results. You can feel this shift even in how you approach rooms now. You're not scanning for validation. You're not bracing for dismissal. You're grounded. You know what you're bringing visually before anything else happens. And that confidence isn't loud. It's calm. Calm enough that you don't feel the need to overcorrect. Calm enough that silence doesn't scare you. Calm enough that you don't rush. And people feel that immediately. Calm reads as control. Control reads as value. There's an honesty that emerges here too. You stop pretending that everyone deserves your time just because they noticed you. You become selective. Because once attention comes more easily, you realize how expensive your energy actually is. You don't want to spend it explaining yourself to people who already decided who you are. You want to spend it building, connecting, moving forward. Presentation filtered out a lot of noise before it ever reached you. That's leverage doing its job quietly. You also start seeing how much resistance you had to this idea before, because it challenged an identity you were clinging to. The identity of being the deep guy who didn't care about surface things. The identity of being above it all. But what you were really doing was protecting yourself from disappointment. If you didn't try, you couldn't fail. If you didn't invest, you couldn't be rejected for trying. And that logic feels safe until you realize how much life passes you by while you're protecting yourself from feeling exposed. There's a difference between being authentic and being unfinished. Authenticity isn't refusing to improve. It's refusing to lie about where you are. Improving your presentation doesn't make you fake. It makes you responsible. It says, I understand how the world works, and I'm willing to meet it halfway instead of demanding it meet me entirely on my terms. That's maturity. That's adaptation. And adaptation is what keeps men relevant instead of resentful. You might notice how quickly people project competence onto you now, sometimes more than you deserve. And that can feel uncomfortable if you're not used to it. But instead of shrinking away from that projection, you grow into it. This is where the working smarter, not harder line becomes real. You're not doing less. You're just not wasting energy on avoidable battles. You're not trying to win people over who already decided not to notice you. You're not explaining your worth to strangers. You're not chasing curiosity that should have been automatic. You put the work in up front, and now the system works for you instead of against you. That's intelligence, not vanity. You'll also start recognizing when other men are stuck where you used to be. You hear the frustration in their voice. You hear the rationalizations. You hear the moral arguments against caring about looks. And instead of arguing with them, you just observe. You know now that this lesson can't be forced. It has to be felt. It has to be proven through experience. No amount of logic replaces the moment when someone treats you differently for the first time and you realize how much leverage you were ignoring. There's a story that always comes back to me here. A man I knew was deeply against the idea of investing in appearance. He believed it cheapened things. He believed it attracted the wrong kind of attention. He believed it wasn't him. Years later, after watching opportunity after opportunity pass him by, he finally changed his mind. Not ideologically, practically. He treated it like an experiment. He said, "I'll try this for 6 months." The results weren't dramatic. They were consistent. More respect, more invitations, more ease. At the end of it, he said something that stuck. "I didn't become someone else. I just stopped making it hard for people to take me seriously." That's the core of this entire conversation. You're not trying to impress everyone. You're trying to stop handicapping yourself. You're trying to make your value visible enough that it doesn't require a pitch. And once that happens, you don't feel like you're chasing anymore. You feel like you're selecting. Selecting conversations, selecting environments, selecting women, selecting opportunities. And selection feels very different from pursuit. It feels calm. It feels grounded. It feels adult. You might worry that this makes things too easy, that it cheapens attraction. It doesn't. It clarifies it. People who are only interested in surface will reveal themselves quickly. People who are interested in substance will stay long enough to discover it. Presentation doesn't confuse those two groups. It separates them faster. That saves you time. And time is the one resource you never get back. If you're still here, still listening, it's probably because you're starting to see how much resistance you had to something that could have helped you years ago. That resistance wasn't stupidity. It was fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of being seen. Fear of putting in effort and not getting the outcome you wanted. But fear doesn't disappear by avoiding it. It disappears by being confronted and disproven. And the only way to disprove this fear is to actually try. Chapter 4. And once you really sit with that, once the resistance burns off and what's left is clarity instead of defensiveness, you see how backwards you had it for a long time. You thought standing out meant trying to be loud. You thought presentation meant flexing. You thought investing in how you look meant you were compensating for something missing. But what you were actually doing before was compensating for invisibility. You were working overtime to overcome a first impression you didn't need to lose in the first place. There's a quiet confidence that comes when you stop blending in on purpose, not arrogance, not bravado, confidence rooted in alignment. You know your exterior isn't betraying your interior anymore. You know that when someone sees you, the first read they get isn't wrong. It might not be complete, but it's close enough that curiosity replaces doubt. And curiosity is the gateway to everything else. Without it, nothing starts. With it, things unfold naturally. This is where the phrase, "make yourself the obvious choice," stops sounding like marketing and starts sounding like self-respect. You're not trying to dominate anyone. You're not trying to intimidate. You're not trying to outperform every man in the room. You're simply refusing to hide. You're refusing to show up looking like an afterthought in your own life. You're refusing to leave your value up to imagination. And imagination is where people default to average every single time. You realize now that most men don't lose because they're lacking. They lose because they're unclear. They look like everyone else. They move like everyone else. They dress like everyone else. They groom like everyone else. And then they wonder why they get treated like everyone else. Average effort produces average perception, even when the man underneath isn't average at all. That disconnect is what creates frustration, not rejection, misrepresentation. Think about the environments where this matters most. Walking into a room, sitting at a bar, standing in line, being introduced to someone new. These are moments that last seconds. You don't get a warm-up. You don't get a resume. You don't get context. All you get is a glance. And that glance decides whether you're engaged with or ignored. You can call that shallow, or you can call it reality and use it. The men who win don't argue with reality. They position themselves inside it. This is why the fear of doing too much fades once you understand the cost of doing too little. Doing too much gets you laughed at occasionally. Doing too little guarantees you get overlooked. One stings for a moment, the other drains you over years. And most men choose the slow drain because it feels safer. But safe doesn't build a life worth remembering. Safe just keeps you comfortable enough to stay where you are. Once you start getting better outcomes, the debate ends on its own. There's something powerful about no longer needing to convince anyone of anything. You're not trying to prove you're valuable. You're demonstrating it quietly. Your appearance says you have standards. Your grooming says you pay attention. Your posture says you're grounded. Your clothes say you chose this. Your presence says you belong. And all of that happens before you ever speak. When you finally do speak, people are already listening. This is the part men rarely talk about. Being chosen isn't about being liked by everyone. It's about being unmistakable to the right people. Standing out filters. It repels people who aren't aligned and attracts those who are. Blending in does the opposite. It invites everyone and connects with no one. If you've ever felt surrounded but unseen, that's why. You didn't offend anyone. You just didn't register. You don't need luxury to do this, but luxury amplifies it when it's available. If you can afford nicer things, enjoy them. There's no virtue in pretending otherwise. But the core principle stays the same at every level. Clean, intentional, fitted, thoughtful, consistent. Those qualities don't scream money. They whisper discipline. And discipline is attractive in every context because it signals reliability and self-respect. At some point, you'll catch yourself walking past a mirror and not criticizing what you see, not hyping yourself up either. Just acknowledging that you look like someone who has his life together, or at least is on his way there. That quiet nod of self-approval matters more than compliments from anyone else. Because it means you're no longer asking the world to validate something you haven't fully claimed yourself. This is also where the chase ends, because you're no longer scrambling for attention. You're positioned, you're visible, you're legible, and when you're legible, people come to you already halfway convinced. You don't need to sell the dream. You look like the beginning of it. That's a completely different dynamic than trying to talk someone into seeing what you could be if they just waited long enough. If you think back to the Rolls-Royce image, it's not about the car. It's about the certainty. That car doesn't need a pitch. It doesn't need context. It doesn't need explanation. Its presence answers the question instantly. That's the level of clarity you're aiming for with yourself. When you have that, the world responds accordingly. Not perfectly, not always, but consistently enough that you stop feeling invisible. You might feel a twinge of regret thinking about how long you resisted this, about the opportunities you missed, about the years you worked harder than necessary. Let that regret pass. It's not useful to punish yourself for something you were never taught properly. What matters is that you see it now. And seeing it now gives you leverage going forward. Leverage to change outcomes instead of complaining about them. If this conversation reframed something you used to argue against, like the video. And if you want to keep building a life where you don't have to beg for attention or explain your worth, subscribe. This isn't about vanity. It's about positioning. And positioning is the difference between being overlooked and being chosen without asking. In the end, it's simple, even if it took a while to accept. If you want to get chosen, you can't blend in. You have to stand out, not loudly, clearly. Make your value easy to see. Make your presence hard to ignore. When you do that, the choosing happens without effort. And once you experience that shift, you never go back to working harder when you could have been working smarter all along.